Magical and fantastical creatures are pretty much a staple of the fantasy genre. And while many of them fulfill roles which in real life would be occupied by wild animals or even natural disasters, there's another whole bunch which are way more similar to humans than anything else that exists in real life. In fact, so much so that elves, dwarves, orcs, goblins and the like are all very much capable of using human weaponry as well or better than humans, which allows for some fascinating world building, because not only are these creatures different culturally from humans and would probably have developed a variety of different archery styles, but they're also different physiologically. They're taller or shorter or have different number of limbs or different bone structures, and that would have a huge impact on how they use weaponry. Hi, my name's David. I'm an archer, a trick shooter, and a pole dancer. But I also have a degree in anthropology and a master's in biology. And for the first time, I'm going to use all of that together to talk about different fantasy species using a bow. My favourite thing in any story is taking something ridiculous seriously. Unrealistic stuff is what makes fantasy fantasy, whether it's a city in a dormant volcano or a pole dancing archer in heels. But if you live in a crater, what happens when it rains and everything washes to the middle? Or when you need to cross some soft ground? Sometimes these things are just there for the impact in the moment, and that's fine. But when a story takes the time to think about the implications and build them into the world, it can make the whole thing feel more grounded and lived in, or give you more opportunities to be silly. So if you're telling a story or running a game, try to keep track of those epic moments or one-off jokes and see if you can build them into something more. World Anvil is a tool designed to help writers and DMs build their world from the ground up, with interactive maps, character creators, relationship trackers, and all manner of other ways of keeping track of those small details so that you can build them into epic stories. So if you like taking your fantasy seriously, give World Anvil a try. Okay, first off, let's set some expectations here. I am not going to be talking specifically about different styles of archery done in different cultures in the real world. I've done that, I've talked about that in a different video. What I want to talk about and what's fascinating me is the way that a different structure of body and a completely different physiology from the ground up would affect how someone might use what is functionally an incredibly human weapon. Because that's what bows are. Unlike, say, a club or a stick, everything about how a bow is used and functions relies on biological features which are more or less unique to humans. So before we go and trek off into fantasy species, let's first look at us. Humans are really kind of weird. Like most land vertebrates, we have 4 limbs, but unlike the majority of them, we only use 2 of them for the vast majority of our moving around. But while other bipedal species like ostriches or T-Rexes have largely lost the use of their upper limbs, we have a pretty recent evolutionary history of using them to get around. And that presents some fascinating opportunities for using them for other stuff. Unlike, say, a horse or a dog, which has shoulders designed for this range of motion, ours are designed to be able to open all the way out, bring it over our heads, and swing from branch to branch. And that same flexibility in the shoulder blades is exactly what allows us to draw back a bow, as well as allowing for some relatively complex motions when it comes to wielding other weapons. And while in theory, another type of ape with similar limbs, like an orangutan or a chimpanzee, would be able to draw back a bow, and they might even have enough manual dexterity to be able to nock an arrow, the fact that they still use their forelimbs for a lot of their movement and balance would make prolonged shooting sessions much more difficult and make it a lot harder for them to do something like this. All of which is to say that bows are very much designed to be used by humans and things with human anatomy. And although there are many adaptations you can make in the event of an injury or a change to your anatomy that can still make it practical to shoot a bow, such as, for instance, using your feet, a culture of warfare developed by somebody that does that is going to look very different. And therefore, any way in which a fantasy species differs from the archetypal human bone structure is going to make quite a big difference to how they use a bow. So, on with the creatures. Now, unfortunately for things like this, words like elf, goblin, gnome, dwarf, troll, and fairy have been more or less interchangeable throughout various mythologies. And you can't necessarily guarantee that if you take a troll in one setting, it's going to look anything like a troll in a different one. So what I'm first going to do is talk about size. Does size actually matter? Unfortunately, as anyone who's ever gone bouldering with a short friend, dated a male porn star, or otherwise wrestled someone who's larger than them will tell you, it can make a pretty big difference. And the same is true with archery. Ultimately, there are lots of different styles of bow, and some are more efficient than others. But assuming a relatively similar level of efficiency, there are two ways to increase the power output. The first is to change the draw weight, aka the stiffness of the bow. And the second is to increase how far back you draw the bow so that more of that energy is imparted into the actual arrow. So naturally, a fantasy species that's only 2 to 3 foot tall is going to have much less draw length on their bows. And even if they make really small but powerful bows to compensate, like this 80-pound crossbow prod, it's still going to have a lot less range and penetrating power than a full-length draw from a human, even using something like a 45-pound horsebow. So in an open battlefield, or especially against armoured opponents or other battalions of ranged fighters, a small creature, like a stereotypical fairy or gnome or something like that, is going to really, really struggle to bring their weapons to good effect compared with something larger and more standard size for a human, like a human. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have your tiny fantasy creatures using their bows, but it does mean that it's going to change what is the most viable tactic. And that's what this is all about. Because the small size comes with advantages. Something tiny is much more difficult to hit by an enemy ranged unit and is harder to see. So you'd expect a few different things. One is essentially skirmishing styles. For something small and hard to hit and fast, they might fly in a zigzag pattern, get in close, make a shot, fly out again. The second is ambush tactics, in which small creatures use their small size to be hard to see, hiding in places that larger creatures just wouldn't even think to look, and then popping out when they're close enough, making their shot, and disappearing again into places they can't be pursued. And that solves the range problem. But what about power? Because in human warfare, as armor became more and more advanced, the general trend with bows was that they either got phased out in favor of something that was easier to make powerful, or they got heavier and heavier draw weights. And while both of those are perfectly valid for human warfare, there are other options when we're looking at fantasy species. For starters, in many, many cultures, humans have had weapons that were not designed to deal damage purely from the impact itself, but from some additional secondary effect. Poison darts, for example, shot from a blowgun, are not going to make a hole in you big enough to kill you, but they don't need to. And fire arrows were used to kill buildings that you were not going to chop down simply by hitting them with arrows. And given that fantasy tiny creatures tend to be either really good with magic or kind of crafty at inventing things, then things like explosive arrows or magical sleep or charm arrows or various other things that we don't have in real life would also be options in addition to that. So yes, it would be really nice to be able to just make massive holes in your enemy and break them apart. But for a species that's developed using bows alongside much bigger creatures, that's not really a viable option for, they might start to get a little bit more scary with how they use their arrows. After all it needs to do is get there and apply the effect that you've added, so the power becomes a secondary consideration. And for something that's tiny with really small lung capacity, then a bow is still going to be a better way to get that dart into its target than throwing it or using a blow dart. So if small creatures are going to really struggle to get enough power out of a bow and need to use craftier options, then we would expect the opposite to be true of something big. If we're looking at the stereotypical massive orcs, or the like bugbears with really long limbs, or giant folk, or something like that, we would expect a bow that they use to be absolutely monstrous. Or would we? The simple answer is yes. If I was twice as big and everything was in twice as large proportion, then even if this bow had the same draw weight, I would be pulling it twice as far back, and I would be getting a significant boost in the impact energy of my arrow. And given that I'm twice as big in every dimension, my muscles can probably take a lot more strain, because they're essentially 8 times as heavy And that means that I could put even more power into my bow and make even bigger holes in the things that I'm shooting at. But there's another factor here, and that's materials and logistics. Because it's relatively easy to scale something down and make it kind of do something. The materials already have the properties you want, and you're trying to do something on a smaller scale. But if you want to take a regular human-sized longbow and make a version that's twice as long and twice as thick, then it's going to be a lot harder, if nothing else, to find a bit of wood that has the dimensions and the straightness and the properties that you require to be able to do that. Even just for regular longbows, in the 100 Years' War, England's demand for the wood to make those pretty much wiped out yew trees across large swathes of Europe and made it increasingly difficult, and they had to import them from further and further abroad. If you now need trees that are twice as big in every dimension to be able to achieve that, then either your fantasy setting needs to compensate for that to make that happen, or you might start to see something different happening. After all, more or less the point of a bow is that it is a lever that allows me to put more power and energy into a projectile than I could reasonably achieve by just throwing it. But if I were twice as big and much stronger and had longer arms, then my thrown attacks would become much more viable. For instance, I can chuck a brick about that far, which is pretty rubbish. But if I were exponentially stronger, that brick's going a hell of a lot further. And something aerodynamic like a javelin is going to become a much more deadly weapon in the hands of a large creature. And yes, obviously, if that large creature has scaled up to a much more powerful bow, then that is still going to be more deadly in their hands than the javelin is. But at that point, does it need to be? And the big factor here in terms of how good a giant folk culture is going to be at using bows is, well, let's be honest, how much the author wants them to be. But if you want to make it viable, it really just depends on whether there's anything they need that extra power for. Because a culture that is doing absolutely fine with thrown spears against things that are smaller than them, or even, let's be honest, against something like a mammoth, they would be fine hunting that with a spear, probably doesn't need to go to the effort of developing bow technology. And given that the bow technology is going to be harder to develop at that kind of size and scale, then we might see that actually for the larger species, it's much more rare to find someone who uses bows. Perhaps those are the more inventive individuals that have come across other archer cultures and have tried to adapt their weapons to their own size and strength. And in that case, they would be phenomenally good at it and phenomenally dangerous. But another factor to bear in mind is that in war or hunting or self-defense or whatever, once you get egos out of the way and it just comes down to survival, very rarely does anyone carry more firepower than they need to be able to reliably defeat their enemy. And so for a culture that is much stronger than those that they're fighting, they might have incredibly powerful heavy bows that they bring to bear against the giant monsters of the world, or other similarly sized powerful creatures that have developed thicker armor. But if they're going up against regular humans in regular human armor, then there's a pretty good chance that the bows they would use and the technology they would use would be of a similar power level to regular human ones. So that they're not wasting their energy on shots that can pierce through both sides of somebody's armor and come out the other side and dig into the ground, but instead are spending that same amount of power and energy shooting multiple arrows quickly from a bow that is more than powerful enough to defeat their enemies. So in which case we might see bows which are scaled up in terms of size, but not necessarily in terms of power, and they use the natural draw length and the fact that their muscles are just more powerful to do heavy things at greater speeds. Either of those would be fascinating to see, but I know I'd love to see a culture where they swap, because they're now fighting against enemies of completely different sizes and strengths in a way that we just don't really have in the real world. Think of it like a hunter who has a varmint rifle and an elephant gun and uses them for different purposes. But so far, I've been generally assuming that whatever the size of the thing we're talking about, it roughly looks and acts and moves like a human. And that is also not necessarily true for fantasy creatures, and many of them have completely different limb configurations. For starters, let's look at lower limbs. Humans can do archery standing up, or sitting down, or riding a horse, or hanging from a tree, and the end result is broadly the same. So a creature whose lower limbs look like, say, a goat's is probably not going to experience that much difference, assuming they're as good at balancing as a human. But what about, for instance, a centaur? Or some other creature with a similar combination of human upper torso and then like a whole ass animal body behind it? Because they have a very different configuration of limbs. And they've been popular in mythology for a really long time, and seen as archers for a really large amount of that. And one of the popular explanations for this is that they are essentially evoking the idea of a horseback archer. Of the incredibly skilled people who ride around on a horse while shooting a bow in a way that makes it feel and look to an outsider like they and the horse are communicating telepathically, like they are one single creature. And the centaur is surely the epitome of that, because they are one single creature. Their legs, the horse legs, are their legs. They don't need to worry about this second thing with a different mind of its own rearing up in front of them, or panicking, or not going the way they want to go, or bucking them off, because it's them. As long as they have learned to run as a child, they can do their horseback archery and do all of the formidable things that historical horseback archers did, such as circular formations where you shoot at the closest point, reload as you go away, and shoot again, with all of your mates providing a constant circle of fire. Not fire, shooting. Or a Parthian shot, where you make your shot while moving away from an enemy. Now, as a biologist, centaurs confuse the hell out of me, because there is simply no vertebrate that has an arrangement of limbs like that. And that poses a whole bunch of questions like, how does the spine attach? Like, does it have an extra heart and lungs in the top half as well as the bottom half? And if so, how do the circulatory systems connect? All these kinds of things. But most of that wouldn't affect how it does archery. But there is one thing for centaurs that I think would be a bit of a disadvantage compared with a regular horseback archer. For a regular horseback archer, you let the horse do most of the thinking about how it's running, and you just have to control where it's going. And it's using its eyes to look ahead of it, and although horses can be incredibly dumb, it is for the most part going to avoid obstacles on a kind of instinctive level. While you, as the archer, can be looking directly behind you and shooting arrows like this. But if it's my legs and my eyes, and I'm looking behind me while I run, there's a much higher risk that I'm then going to not see where I'm going and career into something, or trip, or fall over. Now, I'm not saying that I would expect that to happen all the time. Probably what would happen is they would develop their own techniques to compensate for that. But I kind of find the image of them tripping over a lot really funny. The next thing to have a look at when it comes to limb configuration is flying. Now, as anyone who's ever played a TTRPG like Dungeons & Dragons will know, flying combined with ranged attacks is phenomenal, because it essentially renders you immune to the attacks of anyone who doesn't have at least one of those features, which includes some of the big, horrifying monsters like a Tarrasque. It would allow for some incredible 3D versions of 2D tactics. The kind of wheel motion that I mentioned earlier in horse archery, in flight, would allow you to make attacks from the lowest point of your wheel and spend the rest of that process out of range of anyone. Because you're shooting directly downwards or diagonally downwards towards a foe, you're going to have more range and more impact than the enemies who are shooting up at you. You will outrange and outpace and outpower your enemies just by virtue of gravity. But that's if you can fly by magic. If the thing that is causing you to fly is essentially levitation, then anything you can do normally with a bow, you can do while flying. It's not a problem. But for anything that is using physical wings to power their flight, even partially, even if they're still using magic to supplement it, is going to have a problem when they also want to use additional limbs to do this. When I draw a bow, my shoulder blades need to be able to move from the position about here to a point where they're touching each other pretty much. And they need to be able to go from all the way up here to down there. They're taking up the majority of my back, and the muscles that move them stretch right the way down to the base of my spine. So, where the hell do the wings go? Essentially, for a creature to fly using physical wings by a process other than magic, they're going to have to make a compromise somewhere in the structure of their body. If they have the standard configuration where the wings sprout out somewhere out of their shoulders, they are not going to have the range of shoulder motion that a being without those wings has. In addition to that, they're going to need all of the shoulder motion and muscles and things to make those wings move. They're going to need giant muscles running under here to pull the wings with enough power to move them. They're not going to look like a human in their upper torso. Even if they're roughly the same shape, you're going to have huge bulging muscles sticking out under here. Their arms are going to be very limited in how they can move, which means for a species like that to use a bow, they're going to probably be in a very limited forwards position like this, which, as you can see, affords significantly less power in the bow. It's doable, but they are not going to be using heavy war bows. They're going to be using light bows and probably similar techniques to the small species to allow them to just pierce enemies and then rely on additional effects after that to be able to actually get the job done. If their wings attach somewhere down the base of the spine, then that allows slightly more in the way of mobility of their upper arms there, but they're going to be suspended basically from the hips. It's a slightly better possibility, but they're going to be quite top heavy if they build the strength to be able to use a bow, which is going to result a lot of the time in them kind of having a thing where they're suspended by the hips up here, hanging down like this and drawing like that. Fine, doable, but it's going to look weird to human eyes. And again, you're going to have huge bulging muscles and weird lumps and things here. Essentially, human pectoral muscles are small by the standards of flight muscles, but they still hugely change the overall appearance of a human physique. So you make something that is big enough to power something this big, and they are going to look grotesque, which is fantastic for world building. I love things like that. But the little dainty wings on the back only work if they're powered by magic. And thus, the archer that relies on them only works if their wings are powered by magic. The caveat to that is the creatures that don't have additional limbs and they use the wings themselves as hands when they're not flying. So bat folk, for example, tend to have, well, their wings are these fingers, just like a bat, and then they have a free thumb. And so they could, by hooking a bow in their thumb, using the fingers kind of folding the wings back out of the way, and then using that thumb hook on the other side, bringing the arrow onto the bow, they could do essentially a modified variant or even a regular variant, if they switch it back around, of thumb draw to make a shot. It would be a little bit awkward, but presumably a species that had had these limbs for more than 30 seconds would have figured out an efficient way to deal with them. And I think that kind of works. For something with wings like a bird, they're either going to have to have developed or redeveloped the use of fingers and thumbs because they don't have any additional joints on them and they can't really move their digits independently of each other. So that's going to become a lot trickier. The standard approach in cartoons is to use feathers as fingers. That's not going to work for drawing a bow. But there is a variant in the Legend of Zelda setting where they actually use their feet for the bow while using their wings for flying, which is in theory reasonably viable, either by using the feet exclusively or some combination of feet and beak. Although it does kind of beg the question of how you load another arrow onto the bow while still flying, but they might find a way to deal with that. Whatever the solution they come up with, a flying species using analog flight is essentially going to be relying on some form of highly modified use of archery, if they use archery at all. And they may in those cases find that it's actually a lot easier to not and find some other way of fighting their foes, such as a long spear or something like that, which would work reasonably well regardless, than it would be to develop archery. But there is another interesting difference, which is a lot more minor, but could still have some very fascinating effects, and that is build. So when you look at something like a stereotypical orc or the larger forms of troll versus a stereotypical human versus a stereotypical elf, and we can pop dwarves over on this bulky side somewhere, there's a vibe difference in how their bodies tend to look. The dwarves, orcs, etc. tend to be more what we call robust in terms of their bone structure and their overall build, versus the elves, which tend to be more what we call gracile. And that essentially means these ones are chunky, these ones are slim. And we're not just talking about variations between humans, where some people are heavier than others. These tend to be bone level and structural level differences, where dwarves are portrayed with much thicker, chunkier bones than any variant of human that you would see in the real world. And elves likewise tend to be lighter and slimmer and more slender, and in a setting that really treats its species properly, not just humans with pointy ears, but an almost alien-looking gracefulness. And for something like archery, that gracile build allows you to do much faster and more dexterous maneuvers and movements, which will produce a very, very different form of archery than someone who has that powerful, clunky build that's probably going to gear more towards heavy war archery and kind of deadly individual strikes rather than fast, sweeping behaviours. So again, there are huge variants in what constitutes an elf or a dwarf or whatever in a different setting. But when you apply the differences in stature in terms of whether they are 12 foot tall or 3 foot tall, you can also look at differences in whether they are robust or gracile. And that is potentially going to have a bigger difference to the style of archery that they do rather than their overall approach to archery as a discipline. So something that is of that lighter, thinner build isn't going to be able to develop the muscles to do heavy, strong war archery without potentially putting their skeleton at risk. When you look at human war archers in real life, their bone structures changed over time from developing at childhood. But if the limits on what your bone structure can grow to are different, then that is going to hit differently. And so for the stereotypical scrawny, skinny, elf-like creature, no matter how graceful they are, they're not going to hit the kind of power out of a bow that you would get from a dwarf. So what they might well focus on as a strategy is faster strikes and more agile movements to keep them out of range of those kind of enemies that have the more powerful, heavy, armor-piercing warbow styles. Conversely, something more robust, like an orc or a dwarf, might be using bows made out of materials that just aren't practical for regular humans, that are stiffer and maybe like short, chunky bows, a bit like the ones designed in The Hobbit, but less square. And they will use them to make relatively slow, in terms of the number of shots per minute, but very powerful shots with really thick, heavy arrows. Maybe. But like with everything else, there will be variation within and between species that overlap. So there might be some speed shooting dwarves and there might be some warbow elves, but they will tend to be probably rarer in their respective communities than they are in their counterparts. So far, barring the occasional lip service mention of birds and reptiles, I've largely assumed that the creatures we're talking about are mammals. And when you look at the majority of fantasy species, races that wield weapons, the majority of them would probably, in the real world, be primates, if not apes. They tend to have a very human-looking body structure, roughly human-shaped heads. There are variations within that, but nothing that's outside of what we've seen in like hominids in the real world. And yeah, that's largely what they are. But some fantasy species have completely different body structures, and we can deal with those on a case-by-case basis. But some of them also have a very different head, and that's important too. When you look at the animal folk, they tend to have a head that is shaped like the animal that they come from. And although their body largely would be able to be capable of the same things as a human body, having a different shaped head will make a difference. Humans have forward-facing eyes. We have two eyes on the front of our head. They look the same way. And that is fantastic for distance judgment because it gives us binocular vision. The two ranges of vision overlap, and they allow us to judge distance by essentially triangulating. We don't do the maths, it happens in our head, but I know the difference between that target, which is there, and that target, which is there, and I can adjust my aim accordingly. If I only have one eye, and I close the other one, it gets a little bit more difficult to pitch where I'm making those shots, and the effect gets more pronounced at greater distances. It's not that you can't aim with only one eye, and you absolutely can, but it's much easier when moving fast between targets to be able to use both at once. And likewise, for aiming at moving targets, closing one eye is a pretty big handicap. So when you then get fantasy species with eyes on either side of their head, based off of prey animals like deer or goats or rabbits, then you have a potentially very, very different approach, because their eyesight does not overlap in the middle. Their distance judgment is a lot poorer, and instead they've got a much greater field of vision, which is fantastic for spotting predators and staying safe while grazing. It's not so good for making precise strikes with a bow at a single target. So for instance, a rabbit folk, if their eyes are on either side, might turn their head a little bit before shooting to be able to line up the distance judgment, or some other adaptive behavior that lets them do that a little bit more easily. Conversely, for something like a hawk, a bird-type species that has a brain that is developed for fast-moving targeting. If you've ever seen an osprey targeting a fish underwater during a dive, they are highly adapted to A, have very, very good eyesight, and B, be able to judge distances accurately and at high speed. So for a creature like that, then mobile and aerial shots and against moving targets would actually be potentially quite a lot easier, because you adapt that up to human level of intelligence and they will just have an exaggerated depth perception and an exaggerated ability to target moving objects. Incidentally, we do have the leftovers of a bunch of those instincts from the kind of arboreal movement that our ancestors did, where the building blocks of human intelligence contain those kind of bits. So you take another creature that has those and build it up into a humanoid variant, then you would see some cool stuff. But given that I'm speculating wildly, why don't I speculate wildly about the one thing that we simply have no data for at all, no reference points, nothing. And that is magic. One thing that many fantasy species have, including fantasy humans, is that they exist in a world where magic is possible. And that could hugely change the way that warfare works, especially if that species has an innate gift or an innate ability to harness that magic. So everything that I've said so far, for the most part, has relied on bows dealing damage in roughly the same way that they do now, i.e. by making a hole in a target. But as mentioned earlier when I was talking about small species, if you have a way of dealing damage that isn't just about making a hole in the target, that hugely changes the way that your bow functions and turns it into a delivery device instead of an actual puncturing weapon. And so for sort of fey creatures or elves or whatever it is, if they have an innate gift and a culture that has developed using magic for millennia, you might find their warfare doesn't revolve around piercing damage or making holes in things, but instead around delivering spells to a target. And in that case, their archery may not use heavy weapons at all. They might use quite lightweight bows and lightweight arrows that only need to get to the target to be able to have an effect. Or for bigger spells, you might see more ritualized shooting that revolve around long, slow, exaggerated motions, which are more about spending the time to power the energy into the arrow than they are about the power of the bow itself. It could be a huge leveler between creatures of different size and strength, but it could also hugely change the way that tactics work. If you've got reliable sleep spells that can be delivered via a blunt arrow, then knocking people out and taking them captive would be a lot easier and would become a much greater part of warfare, involving more ransoms, things like that. If you've got reliable fire spells, then using bows against buildings and things like that would be a lot more common. And if you've got reliable explosive spells, then it would start to look like modern warfare without the need to develop modern weaponry. But charming attacks, blinding attacks, fog attacks, entangling attacks, all of that would change the way that you use weapons and the way that you use combat on a large scale. So yeah, basically everything goes out the window when there's magic. Do whatever you like. And that's it. There are many other things we could look at, and there are many niche species that don't fit these kind of rules, but as a framework, you can use this so if you know how big your fantasy creature is in terms of height, how broad and robust it is in terms of build, and you have a rough idea of its limb configuration and how good it is at magic, then you get a bit of an idea for some different ways that that species could be applying archery that would differ from regular human historical cultures. Anyway, hopefully all of that provides a bit of a toolkit for DMs, game players, story writers, general nerds, film watchers, whatever, for how you can picture these kinds of things in your head. None of what I said has to be true or right in any given setting. It's just ideas and thoughts based on the experience that I have. But if you like it, then please do drop me a comment to say so. Oh, and I should also mention that I have crossed 1 million subscribers recently, which is absolutely ridiculous. And it is all you. It is the 1 million of you that are out there doing this stuff and liking my videos and watching them and showing them to people. That is phenomenal. It means the absolute world to me, because For all that I know some things and do some things, I'm just a guy playing with toys in his back garden. And the fact that some of you like that enough to engage with it and feed it and keep it going while that's all that it is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you all so much. If you want to help this channel and support it further and help me to grow it and do more things, then by all means head over to Patreon, where we've got kind of behind the scenes stuff and additional content. Or if you want to learn some of the techniques that I talk about involving bows, please do head to my school site. There's links for both on my page, and there's a contact email on there. So if you are writing your own stories, building your own world, if you would like me to attend one of your events and do something, or if you would like me to come and help with a film or a video game or something that you're making, please, please, please let me know. I would absolutely love to do more of that kind of thing, because it gets me out of my own garden and out of my own head. As it is, thank you so much to everybody. It is a huge honor to be doing this for you, and I really, really am grateful to all of you. See you around.